Oh, how are you?
Doing well, liking the warm outside.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Amazing.
Yep, spring is in the air, but it's supposed to get cooler again. I don't think this will last, but
Yeah.
it's nice. It's a nice feeling. And Sunday we set the clocks ahead, so it'll stay light later, which is always nice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 7 p.m. or something. That'll be a change
Mm,
for sure.
yeah, it'll be nice. The only trouble is I have a 4-year-old and a 1.5-year-old. It's hard to get them to go to bed when it's light, you
Oh,
know.
yeah, I understand that.
4-year-old definitely doesn't want to, go to bed when it's light out.
It's a challenge.
Hmm.
You'll have to like get room darkening curtains or something.
Yeah, no, I mean we do, but it's still, he still sees we're having dinner and he can see his light out and he wants to go out and play after dinner, or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but that's okay. There's worse things that could happen, right?
Yeah, those are fun ages though.
Yeah, exhausting but fun.
Mm-hmm.
So I think this week with the eye dissection, I will do a demonstration again, but I think I'll take still pictures at those various points. Um, because I think posting still pictures, sometimes you can see the structures um, better than on the camera on the demo.
I was wondering if I could ask you a question about the brain structure in general.
Sure.
Um, And I'm sorry if I missed this yesterday. You may have said something about, I know you brought up like blood brain barrier at
Hmm.
one point in the lecture, and I was having an issue with my connection, so I have to go back and watch the last few minutes of the lecture. But, anyways, um, that tough membrane that we removed at the beginning,
Hmm.
is that like a direct part of the blood brain barrier, or is that more just internal and not that at all?
Right. The blood brain barrier is more of just an internal barrier. It's not related to the meninges.
Okay.
It's just another way of it's only related to the meninges in that they both protect the brain. Right.
All right.
That's the only thing. They're not related to each other.
Okay. Thanks.
Mhm.
Looks like we have a small class today.
Yeah. Right. Weather is nice. Everybody has spring fever
It is.
feeling.
I know
Uh,
it's hard.
yeah.
It's
I
hard
don't
coming
blame,
inside.
yeah, I don't blame anybody for that. Um, okay, so I'll go ahead and get started. Are there any questions? I did post the link so that you can maybe take a few pictures of your dissected brains and upload those to Moodle so that I can give you some sort of a lab grade for doing that. I think going forward, what I'll do is definitely I'll take some still pictures and post those as part of the demo, and I'll be a little more clear and post something ahead of the class next Wednesday saying, I want you to take pictures of the eye. The next thing we'll dissect is the eye. I want you to take pictures at these various stages so that as you're going through it, you can do that. But we're still all just kind of learning. This is the first time I've done it remotely. I've done it in person a million times, but so I will do is get going on the PowerPoint. All right, so we left off talking about structures of the brain, right? And we kind of divided the brain into these big areas: the cerebrum, the diencephalon, the brainstem, and the cerebellum. And I'm going to, in the next few slides, kind of go over those areas in a little more detail. But before we even get to that, there are these areas of the brain called ventricles. And the ventricles are internal cavities. So you probably, when you hear ventricle, you might think of the heart. Those are two of the internal cavities of the heart. A ventricle is just a cavity. And in the case of the brain, they are filled with cerebrospinal fluid. And they are lined with cells called ependymal cells. Ependymal cells can secrete things. And so those actually secrete the cerebrospinal fluid. We have 4 ventricles. The first 2 are just called lateral ventricles. They're not labeled ventricle 1 and ventricle 2. You have 1 in each cerebral hemisphere. It's kind of where the corpus callosum is, and somebody pointed it out yesterday when we were dissecting the brain. It might have been Melissa. She was able to see within the cerebral hemisphere, kind of within the corpus callosum, that there's this kind of hollowed out area where there's kind of that brown stringy stuff, which is cerebrospinal fluid once it's preserved. The third ventricle, so you can imagine the first and the second are 2 lateral ventricles, 1 in each hemisphere. And they kind of lead into a third one in the center, which is kind of in the center and inferior to them a little bit, in the diencephalon. So the 2 lateral ventricles kind of produce a lot of the cerebrospinal fluid. It flows down into that third ventricle, and the fourth ventricle is actually even more inferior, kind of closer to the spinal cord. And so this cerebrospinal fluid is made in the ventricles, and then it's secreted from the lateral ventricles to the third and then to the fourth. And then they have a passageway so that they can have this continuous flow of cerebrospinal fluid. Now, what the heck is cerebrospinal fluid? Well, it bathes the exposed surfaces of the CNS. So the brain and the spinal cord are surrounded by this liquid, this fluid. And a big part of what it does is it cushions the brain and the spinal cord against physical trauma. So think about if you are standing in water, if you're in a pool or a lake or something like that, and you try to kick or punch underwater. Is it as easy as it is in the air, or is it harder?
Harder.
Harder, right? Your fist moves slower, your leg moves slower, and it's because the water actually is absorbing a lot of that energy, right? So it's hard to move through the water. Well, now picture you're sitting in a car and you're traveling at 60 miles an hour, and you unfortunately get into a car accident. Your car comes to a stall, an immediate stop, right? You hit something, and your entire body stops. Your brain is going to hit against the inside of your skull. right? Your brain is also moving at 60 miles an hour. It's going to hit the inside of your skull. If your brain is surrounded by liquid, it's going to absorb some of that impact, right? And so it's not going to hit your skull with as much force. Now, you still get, a concussion, you still get trauma to the brain all the time, but it cushions the brain against that physical trauma. It's going to take more energy than it would if there was no liquid there, okay? So that's how it cushions the brain and the spinal cord. It supports the brain by floating it in fluid, so there's not as much gravity pulling on the brain, right? There's not as much weight on the brain, it's floating. And it being a liquid allows for nutrients and chemicals and wastes that are dissolved in that liquid to move around and to get to the various parts of the brain. And so this diagram just shows kind of the formation of cerebral spinal fluid and how it kind of forms. I lost my cursor again. Sorry. And how it kind of forms here in the center, and it flows. You can see the red arrows. It flows down the spinal cord and back up and comes around the brain. Okay, and so on this picture, they're showing the ventricles. Here are your two lateral ventricles. Here's your third ventricle inferior to them. And then your fourth is all the way down here, almost by the spinal cord. So it's going to be made here and kind of gets secreted down to here and then down to here. So from that, we start talking about the different regions of the brain. The cerebrum is by far the largest region. It includes gray matter and white matter. One of the things that I said to you guys yesterday is that the gray matter is actually mostly neuron cell bodies, neural cell bodies, and the white matter is mostly axons. Okay, and so it includes gray matter and white matter. There are cell bodies and axons. The superficial layer of gray matter is also called the cerebral cortex. So when they're referring to the cerebral cortex is usually the outer layer of an organ. And in the case of the brain, the outer layer of the brain is gray matter. It's mostly those cell bodies on the outer layer. It is also found, gray matter is also found in deeper areas called the basal nuclei, but almost the entire superficial part of the cerebrum is gray matter. The white matter is deep to the cortex. Okay, the white matter is on the inside. The white matter are the axons. So those are the areas that the signal is moving down, right? The signal is moving down those areas. They don't have as many of the dendrites. As far as surface anatomy goes, the surface has a bunch of folds. Those folds increase the surface area so that you have more room for cells, so that there's more room for all these cells to make connections. The raised parts are called gyri. So that's kind of like the mountains or the raised parts. They are separated by sulci, which are the valleys, right? They're the grooves. And then some places you have a deeper groove called a fissure. So a fissure is almost where it's divided. For instance, you have a longitudinal fissure, which runs between both the left and the right cerebral hemispheres, so that they're almost completely divided. The cerebrum is so large that the hemispheres are divided into regions themselves called lobes, and they are named for the bones of the skull that lie right over those regions of the cerebrum. So you have a frontal lobe, a parietal lobe, a temporal lobe, and an occipital lobe. There is kind of this fifth lobe called an insula, which is an area of cerebral cortex located deep to the temporal lobe. So if you were to cut away the temporal lobe, there's technically kind of a fifth lobe in there, or a fifth region in there called the insula. Each lobe has sensory regions and motor regions. So it's not like a lobe only gets sensory information or only sends out motor information. All of the lobes do both. They receive sensory information and then they send out motor information. each hemisphere sends and receives information from the opposite side of the body. So that is true. All of our information, for instance, from the right side of the body goes to the left side of the brain, and the opposite is true. All of the motor information that controls the right side of the body is from the left side of the brain as well. So oftentimes when people have something like a stroke, where they have a reduction in oxygen to part of their brain and they have permanent damage to part of their brain, they will often experience paralysis on one side of their body. And it's the opposite side of whichever side of the brain got damaged. It's the opposite side of that you'll see damage to the muscles of the body. So that's the cerebrum. The cerebrum is, again, this big area up top. So we go from that to a much smaller area called the diencephalon. The diencephalon is kind of this whole middle area. Okay. It contains switching and relay centers. So basically, if you think about sensory messages are coming up the spine, up the spinal cord, they have to go through this middle area to get to the cerebrum. Okay, so it's a relay area. And if the cerebrum is sending out any motor messages, right, it makes motor messages that have to go through this center area to get out through the spinal cord. So it integrates our conscious and unconscious sensory information and motor commands. Everything that's in your cerebrum, that's all conscious sensory information, that's all conscious motor information. So this is kind of integrating, subconscious things with conscious things. It does surround the third ventricle. The third ventricle would kind of be right in here. Here's the corpus callosum. The third ventricle is kind of in here. It has three components: the epithalamus, the thalamus, and the hypothalamus. So here's a place where you start seeing prefixes again. Epi always means above or outer. Hypo always means below, right? I think of things like a hypodermic needle is below. So the thalamus, if you look at this diagram here, thalamus is this rounded area right in the middle. Okay. The hypothalamus is below it. Here's the hypothalamus right below it. The epithalamus is above it. Now they don't really label it here. The epithalamus is, I lost my cursor again, there it is. The epithalamus is right above it. So here's your thalamus, here's your epithalamus right above it. And here's your hypothalamus below. The epithalamus, again, it's the anterior part. It does contain the choroid plexus, which is where you make your cerebrospinal fluid. The posterior part, the back of that layer, is where your pineal gland is, right? So here, again, is your epithalamus. Your pineal gland is right here, right? So this kind of dark brown area is your epithalamus. The anterior area is where you make your cerebrospinal fluid. The posterior area is where your pineal gland is. Your pineal gland controls sleep cycles, circadian rhythms, the fact that we want to be asleep generally when it's dark out and awake when it's light out, right? And that causes even things like seasonal affective disorder, where in this part of the world, it's there's more hours of darkness during the winter. And so some people get kind of more depressed. They feel a little more down because it's dark out more often. That's all related to your pineal gland.
So is that from a lack of vitamin D, or is that just from?
Well, I mean, vitamin D certainly contributes to it. So vitamin D is made by the sun, and if you take vitamin D supplements, and it actually, can boost your energy and your mood. So it's related to that,
But not
it's
entirely.
Also,
oh, wow.
Right, exactly.
Interesting. Thank you.
You're welcome. The left and right thalamus. So the thalamus is that spot right in the center, that circle in the center. It's separated by your third ventricle, which is again where the cerebrospinal fluid flows. It is a relay and processing center for sensory information. So again, I'll go back to this picture of the brain. You can imagine that sensory information is coming up through your spinal cord, it has to travel through this thalamus right in the center to get to anywhere in the cerebrum. Okay. All sensory information other than olfactory passes through the thalamus. What is olfactory? What sense is that?
Smelling?
Smell. Good. So smell doesn't go through this. Smell is kind of linked directly to your brain. Smell is a really strong sense. But all our other sensory information goes through the thalamus to get to the higher brain. And then below the thalamus is the hypothalamus. So it lies inferior to the third ventricle, below the third ventricle. It is associated with the limbic system, which has to do with our emotions. The hypothalamus controls all of our hormones. And hanging down from the hypothalamus is the pituitary gland. And so the hypothalamus controls the pituitary. The pituitary controls all the other glands in the body. Our whole, not the next chapter, but the one after that is all about the endocrine system. So this controls all of your hormones, not only things like testosterone and estrogen, but insulin and glucagon are hormones that monitor how much glucose is in your blood. Calcitonin and PTH monitor how much calcium is in your blood. You know, there are other hormones like epinephrine. There are hormones that do everything to basically to keep your homeostasis, right? Just to keep your internal conditions constant. And so a lot of times that's associated with your emotions as well, because if you have low blood sugar, for instance, you're going to be hungry, and that's going to affect your emotions, right? If you have, you know, high levels of ADH, you're going to be, or I'm sorry, low levels of ADH, you're going to be dehydrated, that kind of thing. So there's a lot of these hormones that are linked to your emotions because of how you'll behave to try to correct those hormones, right? To try to get whatever you need for those hormones. All right, the midbrain contains various nuclei, particularly for cranial nerves. This is where reticular formation happens. It's a state of wakefulness and other involuntary functions. It communicates with basal nuclei. It affects the production of the neurotransmitter dopamine. So the midbrain, don't get confused. The midbrain is not in the middle. Okay, that's the thalamus. Midbrain is down here. Right? It's kind of at the top of the brain stem. And the midbrain is actually, like it says here, it's communicating with the basal nuclei. And so a lot of this part of the brain, the pons and the medulla, is controlling things like your breathing, your heart rate, very primitive things that we don't have to think about that are autonomic functions. So a lot of that is coordinated by the midbrain. So we're not talking about higher brain functions. We're not talking about, you know, logic or speech or anything like that. The pons is that rounded area of the brainstem. This links the cerebellum with the midbrain, the diencephalon, the cerebrum, and the spinal cord. So this links a bunch of different areas together. Again, the pons is this rounded part right here. So it's linking the medulla oblongata, which is below it, to things like the cerebellum, right, into the higher brain centers. This has a lot of influence over the rate and depth of your respiration. It's controlling your respiratory rate and your breathing. Again, it's one of the primitive areas of your brain. Things like your pons and your medulla oblongata are controlling things that are vital to our lives, but that are autonomic functions. The cerebellum I talked about quite a bit yesterday. This adjusts postural muscles to maintain balance. So this is the one that has the sense of proprioception, so knowing where your body is in space. So it has a lot to do with your balance, even though your inner ear also has a lot to do with your balance. And then your medulla oblongata is where your cardiovascular reflex centers are, which adjusts your heart rate and how hard it contracts. And it adjusts how dilated or constricted your blood vessels are. It also is a place that adjusts the respiratory center. It can actually affect the pons to adjust your respiratory center. So usually you associate the pons more with respiratory, the medulla oblongata more with your heart rate. So then this goes back into stuff that we kind of covered at the beginning of the chapter. Sensory pathways. Those are afferent pathways. Those are almost always ascending, right? They're always going from somewhere in your body up towards your brain. This is carrying things like touch, pressure, vibration, proprioception, right? All these senses about sensing where your body is in space. Those are all ascending. Those are all moving up towards your brain. And they do cross over in the brainstem to the opposite side of your brain, so that, you know, senses from my right hand go to the left side of my brain, and, you know, senses from my left hand go to the right side of my brain. And there are these cool little cartoons that I'll show you. I looked one up called sensory homunculus. And what they actually do is they take a map of the body and they correlate the size of different regions of the body with how many sensory receptors that those regions have. So to give you an idea of that, I got the sensory one. So if you guys can see, you should be able to see that. Right? So you can see on this sensory homunculus, his hands are huge, right? His tongue, his lips are huge, meaning that we have a lot more sensory neurons in our mouth and our tongue and on our hands than we do, for instance, in our arms. Look at how skinny his arms are and his legs are. So it's actually just, they usually have huge heads, right? We have a ton of sensory information coming in from our head, from our eyes, our ears, our nose, our mouth, and our hands. If you think about your hands and how many nerve endings you have in your hands, it's a huge amount. So that's what a sensory homunculus looks like, right? So they've actually correlated the size of the different parts of the body with how many sensory neurons they have. All right. And then motor pathways are descending. So sensory pathways are ascending. They're moving up towards the head. They are afferent. Motor pathways, just the opposite. It's coming from the brain, going out to different motor areas. And, you know, an example of that is the corticospinal pathway, which is just producing conscious voluntary control of skeletal muscles. That's what most pathways are doing. They're producing conscious voluntary movement of muscles. Again, they cross over, these axons cross over each other to reach the opposite side of the body. So your left side of your brain is controlling your right side of your body. There is also a motor homunculus, so the same kind of thing. There's a drawing of a human, and it shows the same thing. The hands are big, all of the facial features are really big, because that's where we have the most nerves going to. That's where we have the most fine motor control. And then we get into the autonomic system and the somatic system, which we talked about at the beginning of class yesterday. The autonomic system is involved in unconscious regulation of body functions. So somatic is voluntary body function, so skeletal muscle. Autonomic is involuntary, so it goes to cardiac and smooth muscle and glands. Basically, preganglionic neurons communicate with ganglionic neurons. All that means, all the ganglion is a bundle of neurons. So you have preganglionic neurons that are coming from the brain that are before they get to that bundle, and then you have neurons at the bundle. That's all that means. So it's just, you might have 3 or 4 neurons coming from your brain, and they all come together at the ganglion. They all are synapsed together, right? They all are joining together so that all of their signals are coming together and going to one place together. So here's the somatic compared to the autonomic nervous system. Again, you've got the autonomic nervous system, the somatic nervous system is going to skeletal muscles. And the autonomic nervous system, you can see that you have nerves from the brain going to a particular ganglia, which is then affecting the smooth muscle, the glands, the cardiac muscle, and the fat cells. And then the autonomic nervous system is further divided into sympathetic and parasympathetic. Sympathetic is fight or flight. Parasympathetic is rest and digest. Okay. And there's the parasympathetic division. Again, we're not knowing, I'm not making you memorize the cranial nerves right now. You'll have to memorize them later when you, if you take a 2-semester anatomy and physiology course, you'll have to memorize them. But there are 12 cranial nerves, and within cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, and 10, there are parasympathetic fibers. The most notable one is the vagus nerve. It provides about 75% of all parasympathetic outflow. So you have this neuron going from your brain to your heart and to a lot of your abdominal organs, and it slows them down. It's always carrying a parasympathetic signal. So it's always carrying a signal that's slowing down your heart rate. And then the relationship between sympathetic and parasympathetic is that you either are activating one or the other, right? You're not activating sympathetic to some organs and parasympathetic to others. It's either one or the other. There are some organs that are innervated only by one division, like only sympathetic neurons or only parasympathetic, but most organs have both, right? Most organs have some nerves that are sympathetic and some that are parasympathetic, and they have opposite effects on that organ. And so if you are activating the sympathetic nervous system, well, that's causing your heart to beat faster, and that's causing your lungs to go quicker, your breathing rate, your respiration rate to be faster. But it's also causing your digestive system to slow down. Okay, you can't split that up. It's one or the other. If you want your digestive system to work better, you're going to activate the parasympathetic division, which will slow down your heart rate, slow down your breathing rate. That's all I have for the end of this chapter. Now, what questions do you guys have for me? Nothing, huh?
Well, I have a question about the white matter, and it's just sort of personal because I work at a rest home, and I've been going to neurology appointments with one of my residents, and he's just under 60, so he's younger than, so I thought it would be maybe early onset Alzheimer's. But what the neurologist said last week was that it was, let me try to remember, that it was white matter disease.
Okay.
And that, God, I wish I could remember exactly the words, but something about like a stenosis in the vessels in the white brain matter. Does that, I don't know.
So is he having trouble getting signals to like his muscles to make them move?
Yeah, coordination and memory issues.
Yeah. So that's kind of that's what you see in like ALS.
Yeah.
And so what happens is the white matter it's white because there's this fat essentially called myelin that coats
yes, that was the word I was looking for. Thank you.
So, so myelin coats the axons. It acts like an insulator. It wraps around the axons. And the reason it does that is so you can get a signal from the cell body all the way down the length of the axon really quickly. And when that myelin starts to deteriorate, then it takes you longer to get that signal there. And at some point, it deteriorates enough that you don't even get that signal there anymore. And that's what happens with ALS, is that their brains are fine, right? A person with ALS can understand everything. Their brains are fully capable of everything, but they can't get the signal to their muscles to make them work, right? And that eventually it progresses to a point where they can't get the signal to their muscles to breathe or to swallow or anything like that. And that's there's different ways, obviously, that the myelin can degenerate, but nobody has found a way to make it regenerate yet. So that's one of the that's a really big thing with something like ALS or some of those diseases where myelin degeneration starts to happen.
Yeah, he's working with physical and occupational therapy pretty regularly now.
Yeah, that's
So,
sad.
well, thank you.
No.
It makes a little bit more sense now for sure.
Good.
All right.
Good.
Is MS also a disease of the myelin degeneration? I thought it was for some
Yeah.
reason.
Yep,
Okay.
it is. Yep, absolutely. Well, if there are no questions, definitely email me. I know we have a lot going on. There's please upload some pictures of your dissections to the Moodle course. There's homework for the nervous system, and then there's a quiz for the nervous system. And then next week we'll start the senses. So either Sunday or Monday, I'll post a demo of dissecting the eye and some photos with that. And next Wednesday we'll start class the same way we started this week. We'll start with the eye, and then we'll go on to lecture about the senses kind of in the second half of Wednesday's class. All right. All right, everybody, go outside and enjoy the
Yeah.
weather. It's supposed to be
Thank
warm
you.
and nice today and tomorrow. So,
Thank you.
yeah, you're
Thank you.
welcome.
Have a good night, everybody.
You too.